Hi, this is Ed Kohler with Extreme Networks, and I'm here today to talk with you about emerging trends in the cybersecurity landscape and steps that you can take to protect yourself, your network, and your organization. But perhaps the more appropriate title for this presentation is The Perfect Storm. As you may recall with the book or the movie, there were a series of meteorological events that came together to bring about the storm of the century. And it wasn't too good for the characters involved. Well, in short, we're experiencing the same thing in today's cyberspace environment. So our agenda is going to be fairly straightforward. We're going to talk about this perfect storm. We're going to talk about the security trends that are contributing to it. We're going to talk about the concerns about our network edge. And then we're going to take a proactive look. We're going to start to consider how we can bolster the environment. And then we'll take a left turn towards the end, and we'll save that as a special surprise as we reach the culmination of the session. But first, let's take a look at the numbers. IoT attacks have increased 600% between 2016 and 2017. That is a significant number given the fact that we have 20 billion IoT devices in place today, and we're scheduled to be at 50 billion by 2020. Majority of these devices are connected through wireless. And we also have the fact that we're dealing with just a gross input, an increase in endpoints between 2016 and 2018 of up to 50%. This is creating a new landscape for us. And it's actually culminating into what we would call the perfect storm. Now, we talked about IoT, we talked about cloud, but another consideration is something we've accepted and had for quite some time, and that's BYOD. And many of the devices that we have, and anyone listening to this webcast could probably reach out and touch either a tablet or a smartphone or some sort of Chromebook. And these devices are day-to-day tools. Yet very often we accommodate and we accrue them through private means. But we expect to use them in the enterprise. We expect to use them on a regular basis. Now, here's the important thing. These devices are rather remarkable. They're small mini computers. One could even say they're microcomputers. And they have more computing power than what was used to get us to the moon and back. Yet, if you take away the cloud services supporting the BYOD devices, these devices become rather useless rather quickly. So the long and the short of it is that yes, these are intelligent devices and they bring a wide variety of benefits and services, but they're always tethered to the cloud. And when you look at that, increasingly IoT is needing this as well. What that means is that we're creating solutions and deploying technologies that are requiring the bifurcation or in some instances, the complete dissolution of what we've taken as the traditional security model. So in short, new approaches are going to be required in order to address this new and unprecedented set of challenges that we have before us. So in short, we have to be smart about this. And this is the obligatory cat slide that every internet webcast video needs. I like this because it happens to look like my cat. But in all seriousness, we do need to start thinking differently about what's happening within our security deployments. And also, more importantly, what's happening outside of our vision. And this is something that we're going to take a big focus on in this session. Now, this is a very good comic. I like this, and I inserted it for a couple reasons. First of all, the humor. So I'm going to spend a couple seconds on it so you can read them. They're kind of hilarious. But more importantly, I want to highlight the smart thermostat that's on the wall. And when I was on vacation not too long ago, I was at an Airbnb, and my wife and my daughter and her boyfriend went out to see the town. And I stayed back because I had some emails to do and things of that nature. Well, I finished those emails, and then, of course, as all hackers do when they have idle time, I started trying to enumerate the house because I noticed that it was a smart environment. So I was actually able to enumerate the system, and yep, sure enough, it had a Linux backend. I was able to find out what version it was. I could have gone ahead and investigated vulnerabilities and maybe done some exploits, but I obviously didn't do that because I'm, first of all, an ethical hacker. Second of all, it was a nice place. Third of all, he was a nice guy. But I did highlight to him after the fact that, I was able to see your systems and you probably should have those segmented off. The big point to that is that many of these systems are being deployed into enterprises and residences, and there is no consideration to security. It's just connectivity. If I get connectivity, great, everything's fine. We assume that these devices are secure in some way, and many, many times that is a bad assumption. And a great case point example is a Las Vegas casino that was breached through an internet-connected fish tank. And this is someone that actually used the fish tank to gain access. And obviously, it was a Linux server on the back end. And once they were able to do that, they were able to find other vulnerabilities and then start moving laterally. You're going to see that keyword lateral coming up in several points in this presentation. And through that, they were able to move through the network and compromise the actual database to the casino environment. And that obviously was a big concern. So this is a great example of how IoT was an initial attack vector to a successful breach. But let's go a little further. Let's talk about the nexus. Let's talk about all three technologies. Here's a great example of where we have the Mitre botnet virus, and everyone is familiar with it, at least from the press. But what's not known is that this really was not a malicious thing. This was created by a couple college students trying to gain an advantage at a video game. And it was supposed to be a very targeted attack. However, it got out and it infected just different IoT devices, cameras, printers, home gateways worldwide. And as a result, it created the largest denial of service attack ever on the internet. And it ended up taking down sites like Netflix and Twitter and hampering eBay and Amazon. And the important part about this is that the initial vector of the attack, which was IoT, the compromised cameras and printers and so forth, so on, did not attack the enterprises directly. They attacked the provider for DNS services. That's what took out the enterprises. So the enterprises were never attacked direct. This is a great example of an indirect attack vector, which really can happen out of the result of the nexus of this perfect cloud. Now, to make things worse, once Mirai is out into the wild, we have strong suspicions that nation states are now entering the picture, i.e., they have the code. We have suspicion that there are 11 new exploits, bringing the total to 27. New propagation and obfuscation methods, methods of hiding, methods of propagating and renewing itself. New credentials for brute force, enhanced dictionary support. Extension of the target lists, and this is most concerning, is it's starting to include infrastructure systems and enterprise systems such as digital signage and things of that nature. And do take note of the pop-up that IoT Linux botnets are expected to continue to expand their attack surface. And they're just going to simply do that because it's an open target. And because there's little or no security in these frameworks, it's just something that's going to be leveraged. Now, the financial impact of all of this is significant and growing. The average enterprise cost of a breach is about $1 million today. Actually, I think that's higher now. The big thing is healthcare. It's about 2.5 times higher than the average. And that may seem obvious at first until we start looking underneath at the details. First of all, the potential impact to patients is very alarming. Take note of the insulin pump alert that happened because of the risk of being hacked and actually having the potential to cause a lethal overdose. Look at the received notices in 2017. for life-sustaining pacemakers and falling risk to potentially fatal attacks. Even more alarming is recent research that has shown MRI vulnerabilities. Researchers in Israel have uncovered the vulnerability where cancerous tumors through AI can be literally removed or inserted into or from patient images. The infection can occur either via the actual picture archiving system itself or by direct injection to the device via USB. Once infected, the whole system can actually target images or even specific patients in every image in that patient's record. Both new and stored images can be modified, and up to 90% misdiagnosis has been shown in studies using well-known cancer researchers. So I'm just calling a note to this down below. If you want more detail on it, it's available with the actual research reports as well. Now, this all gets down to the whole challenge of protecting all of these devices. It's the sheer number of them. It's the sheer variety of the type, and the fact that many of them have little or no embedded security whatsoever. Either outdated operating systems, hard-coded passwords, backdoors are very, very often found. It's very difficult to patch against any vulnerabilities. Many times, particularly in medical, when you want to upgrade or patch these devices, it means complete recertification, which is very costly. But also, and this is a scary thing, is that studies have shown that 80% of IoT devices, once they're deployed, either in the residence or the enterprise, do not receive any upgrades or patches after the initial install. And again, the reason for that is many of these are personal devices, or many times departments will deploy IoT as a shadow IT function, just using it to accomplish a couple tactical goals that they want to do, or something quote unquote neat, but they want to stay under the radar from an IT perspective. When you look at all of those vectors, it really creates a complex environment to implement a proper security model. So again, we need to start thinking differently about how we're doing this. And I want to introduce at this point CISecurity Controls, and I'm showing the website down below, cisecurity.org/controls. It's basically very similar to NIST. However, I think it's something that's a little bit more extractable to the common enterprise, based into 3 different functional areas: the basic area, the foundational, and the organizational. The basic covers pretty much the 101, you know, the ability to get vulnerability management, to have proper inventory and control of hardware assets, of software assets. We're going to talk about all of that. Then the foundational piece, which is really around the technology, we're going to talk quite a bit about that as well. And then the third area, which is organizational, which gets into just things that we as people need to do organizationally, such as implementing a security awareness program, such as implementing penetration tests and having red team exercises, and having an appropriate incident response system and approach for when something does occur. So all of this is really holistic. What we're going to do now is step into some of the concerns, and then we're going to highlight the controls that we're talking about as we move forward throughout the session. But we're going to take a focus on the network edge as we do this. Now, why? Well, there's 2 reasons. First of all, Extreme is a networking company. That's what we do. But then secondarily, when you look at it, the network edge is where it's all happening. This is where the end users are plugging in. This is where the IoT devices are plugging in. This is where all wireless, all Bluetooth, this is where the attackers are ingressing. And the fact in the metric of 600% increase in IoT attacks between 2016 to 2017 simply means that we should be paying attention very strongly to this space. So the first thing we're going to look at is wireless. Wireless is a technology that brings a lot of convenience, and I think probably the majority of people here, if you look at your predominant access method, it's probably wireless. very few of us have RJ45s, except for me when I'm in my lab. But the important thing to realize about wireless is the network edge becomes blurred. And wireless signals can be available perhaps in places where we would not intend them to be. And that gets into the classical drive-by hacker and the hacker in the parking lot and things of that nature. And the ability perhaps for a hacker to sit himself as a man in the middle and gain access into the network. And that certainly is viable. However, we have to realize that there's also other ways to do this, such as rogue APs. And a great example of that is if you expand a little bit, I could perhaps get to know you a little bit. And the attacker could enumerate a user and say, okay, I know that this user goes to a certain cafe every Friday, and they get on the network and they access email, so forth, so on. So there I am as an attacker, and the attacker just simply goes into the cafe before the end user arrives, set up a rogue AP, force the user to join, because setting up a very aggressive signal, which would overbear the normal AP. But beyond that, I look like the cafe's AP. The end user joins, gains access to the network. I let them do it. I let them get their VPN, but I do give them a little gift in the meantime, and they take that back to their enterprise. And that way I can have a payload that I can inject, and that can allow me to kind of gain a footprint into the environment. The most important part about this is if I succeed in any of these methods, I'm effectively behind the security demarcation at that point. And if it's an open IP routed core, then basically I've hit the money load. I can basically execute what I want to execute at that point. The other vector of this is Bluetooth, because yes, Bluetooth is a wireless technology. And again, I'm sure that anyone who is listening to this webcast can put their hands on a Bluetooth device. Maybe it's in your ear. They're ubiquitous. They have little embedded security, and this is meant by the assumption of security by Bluetooth Low Energy, which means that by and large it sleeps until it handshakes and is used. But that has actually been shown to be something that could be compromised. And the important thing of this environment is there's a very strong lack in monitoring tools. And on the converse side, there is an increased prevalence of Bluetooth skimmers and scanners. I actually have a Bluetooth scanner right on my phone. And then there's the possibility of rogue Bluetooth devices that can be inserted in. I would posit a retail environment that's using Bluetooth tags. And perhaps me as an attacker, I could go in and position a few rogue tags throughout the environment where someone might scan that tag and be redirected. Again, I give them a little gift and they take that back to their enterprises. So there's various ways that these technologies can be used as appropriate attack vectors. So with that, enough of the doom and gloom. Right? We've talked about the perfect storm. We've talked about and we've really established that this is really a set of unprecedented challenges that we've really never had to deal with up until now within the industry. So what I want to do is get proactive now, and I want to talk about considerations for bolstering security at the edge. And obviously the first of that is a good, healthy risk assessment. And this is part of CIS Control Basic Group 1, 2, and 3. So they're foundational. One thing I find, though, that surprises me is that many organizations do not do risk assessments, or they don't do complete risk assessments, or the risk assessments that they do are somehow improper. And I think one of the main reasons for that is just the advice of, don't start with your own IT department. Don't start with your security people, because what you're going to do is you're going to go out and you're going to analyze everything. You're going to uncover every stone, every vulnerability, and then you're going to have a big long list and you're going to get into a paralysis stage. It's really better to start with your business. Start with your executives. Start with the department leads, whether you're an organization for government, whether you're a enterprise for commerce, whether you're military, whatever the case may be, talk to your superiors. Identify what those applications are that are critical, absolute services that need to run and absolutely need to be secure. That gives you the first step in being able to prioritize your assessments, okay? The other thing is realize that it's also not only IT that you're assessing, it's your operational technologies and your Internet of Things environments as well. And you might say, well, I'm not a manufacturer, so I don't have IoT or OT. Well, if you have video surveillance, you have OT, IoT. If you have a building management system, you have IoT, OT. You have to widen your scope, and you have to really have very open eyes as far as how you do your assessment. And the first thing is a complete unbiased inventory of what's in your network, what touches your network, and if possible, get a classification of what those devices are, and if some idea of functionally what they're intended to do. The other thing we want to do is make sure that we include any cloud services or data repositories, and we'll have a particular slide on that we talk about. Now, out of all of this, we obviously want to identify vulnerabilities. But if you've taken the steps and the advice that I've given up until now, you will now have the ability through prioritized assessments, a set of prioritized vulnerabilities that you can now start to address. And this creates what I call actionable knowledge, the ability to actually start to move in a positive stance in improving your security profile as an organization. And the last piece to this is do not be afraid to hire outside experts, rather to do the assessment or penetration. Even if you can do everything in-house, it's always wise, perhaps once a quarter, to have some sort of security assessor come in and actually do an unbiased black box view of your network infrastructure, and to be certain that the security that you're assuming has been implemented. Now, this is a little joke here. Before jumping into the clouds, always make sure that you have a parachute. But in seriousness, this talks to basic group 2 and functional group 18, because it talks to data and applications and services and security around those. First of all, people that are trying to get into the cloud, and I've spent about a year dealing with this, organizations try, and many oftentimes they stumble. And it's either importing data into the cloud or in implementing applications and services into the cloud. And these are the particular pieces of advice that I've boiled down out of all of those dialogues over the past year. First of all, before you start moving data into the cloud, classify it. The obvious thing is private versus public, but you could be a little bit more rigid or detailed and implement some CISSP best practices, for instance, for commercial, to do public, sensitive, private, confidential. Or if you're a military or a government, you might go unclassified, sensitive but unclassified, confidential, secret, top secret. And then a very common one in the commercial sector is also private, privileged, proprietary, and for official use only. Those are the things that you want to do. And then you want to decide what data gets ported into the cloud, what data stays in-house. And once you do that, now you need to develop a tracking and accounting mechanism for the data that is ported. And always make sure you have an aging out policy for the data, particularly when it comes to any form of personal information. Perform regular audits to be certain that the data is where you think it is. And the general compass that I like to give people is to think about GDPR, right to forget. If a user came to you from Germany and said, hey, I want you to delete all of my personal information, and that you have to do because you do business with Europe, could you do it? Would you be able to account for all that user's data? I think that's a great metric to keep in mind as you start porting data into the cloud. Now, the other side of this is the applications and services. And many organizations I've talked to have gotten into this and then stumbled. And I think there's a couple reasons for this. First of all, you need to evaluate and classify applications and services before you go to port them into the cloud. Obviously, one of the key things I emphasize is look at them from a security scope. Is this something you want to have in the cloud? Then also there's the aspect of cloud readiness. Has it been tested? Does it work? I always advise that if you're going to do this, prototype it in a non-production environment for a few weeks, get a taste of it before you actually spin it into service. The other thing to consider that I find often is not considered is information use. What kind of data does this application or service generate? How does it move? Does it stay in the cloud? Is it to come back? Is it PII? Is it pretty much transient? You need to get a handle on the information use and management if you're going to secure this environment down. Now, once you've done that, you're not done yet. You have to perform regular risk assessments and security audits against those services. Part of that is proper web services design. Just looking at input validation. Is there JavaScript or XML insertion capabilities? Am I doing proper input validation and delimitation? Error responses. Many times, attackers will use error responses off of web services to enumerate those services. And this is just giving too much information. Invalid username, invalid password for known user, those types of things. We don't want to give that type of information. So giving as minimal information on the error responses as possible and making sure that you audit that to make sure that you don't give gratuitous amounts of information to anyone that might be trying to enumerate your sites. Segmentation. We all know that this is number one in the book, and it's the best recommended practice for security. And it is also the best recommended practice for IoT. IoT solutions cannot be trusted, and they must be separated from the enterprise users to reduce risk. And yet we see that only 5% of IoT devices today are appropriately segmented. Now, we have a hopeful number here that says by 2021, we will have 60%, but that still leaves 40% of IoT devices that are in amongst the common users in critical systems. Clearly, we have to investigate why the long lag. Well, it actually gets to an investigation that Gartner did in 2017, and they've talked to a number of customers where they found that with more advanced technology threats, obviously segmentation and isolation designs need to become more advanced as well. And they find that many customers try to reach this goal, but they abandon them, basically because it was seen as too onerous or too expensive. And some comments actually said it didn't seem to increase the risk assessment, didn't seem to better the profile. If anything, it made the assessment more onerous because now I have to, as I start to utilize route policies and access control lists, all of those things become part of the actual security assessment. And it just starts ballooning and mushrooming into something that actually gets uncontrollable. And many organizations just choose to stop and abandon the practice. Now, at this point, I want to introduce the Extreme Fabric Connect technology, which is part of our autonomous campus fabric. This is based on an IEEE technology, and it is probably, out of all technologies that exist on the planet, the best marriage of Ethernet and IP, in the fact that IP is truly virtualized, in the fact that it no longer provides any routed path behaviors, and it also provides no utility in establishing the topology of the network infrastructure. So a great analogy is that what KVM and VMware did for the data center server environment in virtualizing physical machines, we are doing in the networking environment for virtualizing IP as a service. And what that does is that actually creates a very deep MPLS-like functionality without the complexity of MPLS, which means that now this complex microsegmentation that we've been speaking about is something that's obtainable without the need of obtuse technologies, route policies, or access control lists. And a great example of that is the Downtown Grand Casino in Las Vegas. As you can see, there was a gaming control board edict that you can't have surveillance, point of sale, back of house, slot machines, telephony, guest services on the same network. However, we were able to prove that our technology is capable of providing the equivalency of air gap, and we did that through working with various consultants and test beds. And as you can see, we actually have been given a waiver and actually have the ability to implement this technology. And that's a great statement to the technology and the contribution that we bring to functional group 9 and 12 and then the CIS controls. But this only works if we know who or what belongs where. And this includes users and IoT devices. And the best approach is a policy-based network segmentation. And this addresses CIS control foundational groups 9, 12, 14, and 15. And what we found is that overall, the best approach for IoT is a whitelist profile. IoT devices tend to have very narrow ranges of behaviors, so the best thing is to provide a deny all unless specified by a specific profile. So we've done a lot of work in learning what IoT profiles are and then developing policies out of those profiles, which are basically whitelist based. Now, end users, obviously, human beings are not as narrow in the way they function. Someone may go to a website today, and then they might not go there for 6 months. And then they may go there for 3 or 4 days 6 months later. That's the way humans are. We have very broad ranges of behavior, and sometimes they're fairly unpredictable. So the option there is that we implement strong monitoring of end-user systems in and out of secure segment boundaries. For all systems, regardless of whether they're human or otherwise, the best approach is an elastic boundary, so that there's an authentication and classification, and then an authorization, and then the extension of the service out to the edge for the particular device that or user that is accessing the network. And then more importantly, once the device powers down or disattaches or moves outside a wireless range, that service is retracted back securely into the core. Because of the autonomous nature of its behavior, this becomes very friendly from both an AppX and OpEx standpoint, because it's something that can really scale quite well and be addressable not only for IoT devices, but human beings and mobility as well. Let's not forget BYOD. This is a great example of policy edge controls. And again, this is foundational group 9, 12, 14, and 15. And this is the concept of traffic corralling, which was initially coined by the NSA. And this is the ability to corral traffic into certain patterns for monitoring and security control. In this example, we have a series of IoT medical devices, MRIs for this case, and we have just a series of ports. The ports have been changed to protect the innocent. But as you can see, we have a series of ports that go to the IoT server. This is the server that manages those MRI components throughout the environment. And notice how that behavior is constrained to the L3 VSN by policy. Yet, we still have another port, port 80, which we're just using as a web port to allow access so that people who are authenticated and authorized into the physician network can now get access to the medical images. But notice how they can only get access to the images, they can't get access to the IoT server, and they can't get access to the IoT medical devices themselves. They are completely isolated. This creates a bifurcated policy environment. Now, this may sound very specialized, but I want to kind of open your eyes is just take those IoT medical devices and make them video surveillance cameras. Take the IoT server and make it a video management system for video surveillance. Add another point for a digital video recorder, and you have the same framework. Everything would be constrained within that L3 VSN for video surveillance, and the physician VSN would now become a security VSN. From there, the security guard desks will be able to get access to the VMS, but they wouldn't have direct access to the DVR or the cameras themselves. So this becomes a great example of a bifurcated policy and various solutions that it could be used in. Now, Obviously, or if we're going to implement these types of policies and behaviors, we want to have visibility. And visibility is a critical piece to securing the infrastructure. Remember, if you can't manage or secure something, then it basically is, as we said earlier, something in the wild in your network. So we really need to realize that we need to get visibility right down at a granular level. And the reason for this is because more and more traffic is moving east-west laterally through organizations. And malicious traffic will often utilize those low-level peer-to-peer patterns. And they try to blend in with those flows. We also have to realize that centralized firewalls are very good for north-south, things trying to get in or out of the segment, which is where we'd monitor for user patterns and behaviors, but they're not so hot for this east-west peer-to-peer pattern things. There's only so many places where you can take high-cost firewalls and place them. So the firewall or IDS will often miss these patterns, and that's really what application telemetry and analytics within Extreme is all about, is to bring that intelligence to the wireless or wireline edge and then start to look for anomalous traffic within a segment that can be monitored or blocked. Okay, so that's the whole picture here. Now, there's various ways this can be used. This can be used for application performance. This can be used for troubleshooting, but a very good use of this for telemetry and analytics is within security to identify odd behavior and anomalies that should be investigated and followed up on. Compliance is the other piece that we talked about earlier, and let's face it, it's boring. HIPAA, PCI, GDPR, they all have to be done, but they're not glamorous. What we have done is we've worked to provide a framework where we automate as much as possible within the network configuration, both from a hardware, software, locking down of the nodes perspective. And this eliminates as much as possible manual audits and errors that could arise in this area. And it also allows the ability for the tool to be run on a various semi-regular basis, if you will, so that you can get some sort of report card of where you are within your framework as far as compliance is concerned. Now, there are a number of areas that we have for research and development at Extreme. We've talked about a few already. First of all, Extreme Fabric. The thing I want to highlight is the fact that we've had 0 breaches in any hackathons or penetration tests up until this date. And we have done some very serious stuff with customers or with different 3-letter agencies or international governments where they've really set up and created some orchestrated penetration red team environments. We've also done it for fun at various trade shows or sometimes at universities where we'll bring in students and let them hack. The point is that no one has been able to mount a successful breach across the hypersegmentation that has been offered within the fabric up until this date. Extreme control is, again, that part of the, know who or where goes what and where. And the big thing here is role-based access, device profiling, fingerprinting, and drawing this across the boundaries of wired versus wireless, and also between human user versus IoT, and bringing this all into a single pane of glass control environment. Air defense is a wireless intrusion protection system, and with that, we have the ability to bring forensic analysis and then automatic mitigation for some of the things the threats that we talked about earlier when we talked about edge security concerns. Defender for IoT is basically a solution that was created with the help and assistance of some of our major healthcare partners to lock down and secure healthcare equipment, particularly mobile equipment, within a hospital environment. But it also could be used for any type of IoT solution where you would normally be forced to rely on something like MAC authentication. What the Defender for IoT does is it puts in a front proxy, in essence, a firewall for IoT that allows it to authenticate on behalf of the IoT device and then provide strong profiling and management of the device within segmentation and secure zones. And do note that it is an Edison Award winner as of last year. Information governance engine, PCI, HIPAA, GDPR, we talked about that already. And then we'll wrap with Extreme AI, which today is focused on Wi-Fi automation. And there we focus pretty much in the public venue space where you look at stadiums, theaters, concert venues, malls, things that have a dynamic potential of change in RF profile from an empty stadium to a full stadium at game time, for instance, and the ability to optimize the wireless environment, because the methods are well known to optimize. What we do is we incorporate the AI to basically automate those behaviors. So as the population within the stadium changes, there's a dynamic change to the actual RF power profiles. AI for security coming out very shortly, again, based on the same precedent of where we basically have untrained machine learning that works against a basic set of assumptions and frameworks. And there'll be more that we'll talk about that in the near future. Now, I want to introduce all of these components in a different perspective now, and this is the introduction of what we call extreme elements. And as you can see, we have a very wide array of technologies available to us, ranging in class from artificial intelligence to automation, to analytics and insight, to security, to actual SDI itself. But I really want to focus on the upper portion of the slide with the open ecosystem at this point, because this is where we're going to take it now. This is a look at the extreme network elements, and I want to highlight the upper portion where we talk about the device partners, the stack partners, the cloud partners, and the application partners. Now, notice that everything else is pretty much technology that can be provided or interfaced to through extreme. But the reason why I want to talk about the partners at this space is the fact that in order to realize a true end-to-end security play, we have to realize that we need to support an open ecosystem to get the wider CIS control coverage. We have to realize that no one vendor or solution can address all of your security concerns. And if there is a vendor that is coming in and telling you that, they're lying to you. That's basically it. We have to realize that we need a cohesive open ecosystem, and that's essential to create an integrated and automated threat detection, intelligence, and mitigation theory. Now, the big part about this is that the network has to become an active participant in all of this. And this is really what Extreme Networks has been placing a lot of R&D emphasis into over the past year. Because really, when we look at it, the security ecosystem is kind of listed and been existing in a world on its own. You had your firewalls, your security event management, your antivirus, your intrusion detection. They were all run by security staff. They usually never interacted with the networking folks who were involved in the provisioning of the network and policy switching. Perhaps security encryption might have forced a dialogue between the two environments, but by and large, they were separate worlds, and we really had to coordinate those environments manually. Well, a lot of work that we've been doing with Extreme Management Center and Extreme Connect is to create a true open security ecosystem, and that requires an active bidirectional API environment. So we've created a complete set of northbound API environments that are very, very open. Now, you might say, well, that's great. You've probably done this for one or two vendors. Well, that's not true. We have a very open security ecosystem, and here are just some of the vendors that we've integrated with. And I do want to emphasize that this is not an exhaustive list. So we've done quite a bit in creating a bidirectional framework where the firewall can alert our network and we can react according to those alerts, or bidirectionally, we can actually alert the firewall according to something that we're seeing at the low-level peer-to-peer network level. And this creates a true open security ecosystem that can be leveraged and future-proofed as we move forward. So let's take a checklist of the CIS controls now. If we look at the ecosystem we established and our active integration with those players, we see that we address a very big swath of the CIS controls across the basic, as a matter of fact, all basic categories, foundational, and then also even into the organizational space as well. If we look in detail as far as what Extreme solely can execute and cover, we have groups 9, 14, and 15. When you look at this cohesively, you see about 90% coverage. The only areas we don't cover in foundational is data protection and data recovery capabilities. And then the organizational side, penetration testing, red team, which are all human exercises, and then obviously implementing a security awareness and training program. Again, a human exercise. So you can see that we can do quite a bit to support the CIS controls and provide end-to-end coverage with the various security partners that we have established relationships with in the industry. Now, at this point in time, I want to stop and introduce the Cloud Security Alliance. I'm sure many of you are aware of it. However, I found that some are not. This is a great repository, a great site that gives the use of best practices for providing security assurance for cloud computing. And so a lot of the things that I talked about on the parachute slide is covered in this site. Not only is it a great resource and a great site, it provides an actual social community that you can join as well, so you can talk to other people who have gone through deployment of cloud services or porting data into the cloud and learn from their mistakes, or actually perhaps gain from their advice. Now, here is where we take the true left turn. This individual obviously lived a very long time ago, and there were archaeologists that found this statement on a clay tablet fragment. The fox knows many things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing. Now, originally, these archaeologists thought it was some sort of fairy tale or some sort of Aesop's fable, something for children. But as they found more pieces of the tablet, they were able to decipher the fact that he wasn't talking about a child's tale at all. He was talking about Xerxes and Persia's attempt to invade and conquer Greece. Now, it was not only attempted by Xerxes, but also by Darius later on. But we're going to focus on what Xerxes did, because he threw everything at it. And he basically did not have any view outside of his end goal. So he was the true hedgehog. However, the Greeks were very, very much like the fox. They were able to change. They adapted their strategies. And while we all know about Thermopylae and what happened with the valiant stand of the Spartans, the real victory came from the fact that the Greek citizens, regardless of their city-state, did not cooperate with the Persians. They burned their fields, they burned their farms, and they left basically a barren landscape so that Xerxes could not have his army live off the land as he was so used to doing in the Middle East. So he ended up basically starving his armies in the mountains of Greece. Now, we could look at that and say that that has recurred several times. Napoleon, as of note, in his attempt to conquer Russia, and probably a little over a century later with Germany. In each time, I think hubris and horse blinders are really what is to blame for the overextension of a strategy. We have to realize that we cannot afford that in cybersecurity. In the cyber landscape, things change far too fast. We have to be both the fox and the hedgehog. We do need an overall strategic architectural approach. I'm not going to argue that. We need to have an architecture approach for security. However, we also need to be willing and ready to adjust our approach according to the things we experience and learn, given the fact that things are moving very fast in this environment. And this is what I term as grand strategy, the ability to move and think like the attackers. And that's actually what we're going to do in this type of scenario. We're going to start to put on the black hat. We're going to start to look at what attackers do. What do they do to compromise your network? Well, a big part of that is information gathering. They spend the majority of time doing this, just doing detailed discovery of every facet of your network, every facet of your exposed web services, getting as much physical context, shoulder surfing, social engineering, and even very tailored phishing activities so that they are very, very difficult for even the most educated users to step up on. And this information is used to basically sink and pull information out of the environment until they are able to enumerate vulnerabilities. Once they're able to find systems and identify vulnerabilities, then it becomes a question of moving towards exploitation, taking those vulnerabilities, matching them to exploits, and then, for instance, using DOS or credential cracks such as Mirai, or the remote exploits such as the payloads that I injected through a cafe, for instance, and then the ability for code to have advanced evasion techniques. The ability for it to hide innocently within systems so that antivirus and systems of that nature might overlook these innocent-looking DLLs and so forth, so on. Basically to dissolve the signature of the malware that has been installed. Now, post-exploitation is I want to have persistence. I want to have the ability for that code to come to life, the ability to survive across reboots, things of that nature. I want to have backdoors back into the system. And then I would use anti-forensics, or an attacker would perhaps manipulate timestamps, code removal out of temporary file space, things of that nature, to kind of brush over the footprints so that for all intents and purposes, it looks like you were never there. I may trash user accounts, or perhaps an attacker may choose that the best way is to just totally crash the systems upon exit once they get what they want, because that's really the ideal way to remove all forensic evidence. And this has been scientifically boiled down by what is called the kill chain, which was created by Lockheed Martin. And it was a while ago that this was first formalized, but it was also realized that this is far too simple of an approach in the fact that this gives a linear type of set of steps in an attack, but most often that's not the way it happens. Most often we deal with the concept of attack trees, because an attacker, when they're coming in, usually is coming in a black box or a dark gray box type of scenario. And what do I mean by that? Well, security kind of denotes three types of penetrations. A black box is where the attacker knows nothing about the system whatsoever. But we've already said that attackers go through a large amount of information gathering in the initial phase. So by the time they go to attack, they're usually in some sort of gray box phenomenon, or some sort of gray box phase, where they know somewhat about the network, but they don't have all the information. Their goal is to push eventually into a white box scenario, where they know the network almost as good as you do, and perhaps they know user accounts, they have compromised accounts, they have privilege escalation. Now, more and more, they're gaining control of the network infrastructure. But in order to get there, there are typically a series of new information points that are discovered as they move from black to gray to white. And that creates a set of decisions, obviously, and that allows a set of decisions for the attacker, if and or if or, and basically the whole theory is that as they move into the infrastructure, they want to keep as much of the compromised infrastructure intact as possible. And that's important because they can actually provide command and control for web bots or for exfiltration of data once the target is reached. So this is a concept of attacking trees, kind of roughly shown against the kill chain. And as you can see, as these initial vectors start, there's a series of if and or decisions and perhaps privilege escalations that will eventually compromise and exploit until I get to the target. And from there, I can start to move data out. Now, once I go to move data out, I want to reverse the chain. I want to use the compromised systems and the command and control that I have to pull the data away. And many times, this is done through alternate paths, and it's done in very small chunks of compressed data. One of the last things an attacker would do is set up big, long extractions out of a database. They typically are going to use very small chunks, compress those files, and then move them laterally through the infrastructure in order to get them out. And that way they kind of blend into the normal east-west traffic patterns that are in the normal network infrastructure. Now, I do want to note that in order to get this type of covert network to be established, you need a high degree of lateral mobility across segments. You also need to have the ability to move between these segments. A high degree of microsegmentation, particularly with something like Fabric Connect, will cause and force the attacker to be noisier because they have to move northbound up out of the segment in order to traverse. In order to support these C2 and exfiltration channels, now they have to be noisier. They actually have to force and cross the demarcations. This brings about the introduction of the Mitre Attack defense framework. This is an important knowledge base that I want you folks to be aware of and be familiar with. It creates a common taxonomy for both offense and defense. More importantly, it looks at the techniques and the tools that attackers use, and perhaps some insight as to the methodologies and strategies that they use. And this allows you to create similar adversary models and then build your security assumptions against those adversary models. And this is something that is very, very healthy to do, because what it does is it makes you start to think like the attacker, makes you start to design your systems and applications design, knowing the tools and the techniques that the attackers use. Now, I'm going to kind of culminate here with a handy list here of 15 indicators of compromise, and you can use that and compare it against the Mitre Attack framework. Some of it's rather obvious: anomalies in privileged account behavior, unusual outbound traffic patterns, DNS request anomalies. I'm not going to go through all of these, but do keep aware that if you see any of these things, it indicates that some inspection or some investigation is required. But I do want to follow up with some specific items on DNS, because it is a hotbed of risk and vulnerabilities currently. First of all, make sure you lock down all of your systems to prevent any changes to local DNS systems. Many times DNS settings, it's one of the first things a botnet will change to redirect so that you're going to the systems they want you to go to. Lock down the systems to prevent installation and use of third-party virtual private networks, particularly no split tunnel behaviors. You don't want to have any bifurcated behaviors in your environment, particularly ones that you can't monitor. Lock down your firewalls to allow DNS queries from local DNS systems only. Block outbound port 53, unless it comes from a trusted source, like a known secure DNS forwarder, from a provider partner or something of that nature. Look for questionable patterns in your DNS logs. Queries outside of normal hours. Queries that use non-standard naming conventions. Long tail queries. That shows that there's probably someone trying to enumerate your environment or might even be using it actively for covert channels. Separate traffic. IoT from users from data centers. But get even more specific than that. Separate users by departments, separate IoT by specific technologies, building surveillance versus HVAC versus building entry and exit systems. Think in that granularity, and the more you separate traffic, the better off you will be from a security profile perspective. And finally, be aware of Tor activity, the onion router, the dark web. If you see any systems or users accessing that, you should be tracking that down and investigating why as soon as possible. So to wrap up, in culmination, IoT, BYOD, and cloud are the new attack vectors, and they're culminating in the perfect storm. It's not hopeless, though. We can perform regular risk assessments of our IT, OT, and IoT environments. We can segment or even isolate IoT devices, and that's going to be critical. Policy controls are going to be required in and out of segments with strong monitoring. Application telemetry can help us pick out these anomalies within a segment. And then we have to realize that security really does have to be an open ecosystem that can share information at the API level. And we need to adopt a layered and open approach to our security. Finally, utilize CIS controls. Utilize the Cloud Security Alliance, and above all, utilize the Mitre Attack framework. They're great tools. They're rich repositories of information to help you bolster your security profile. And the best part about it is they're completely free. So if you want to learn more, there's another webinar you can look. Secure, Are You Sure? Practical tips for securing your network, and then also a blog that's talking about edge security and how close are we to being able to leverage machine learning and artificial intelligence to help us. Thank you very much for your time. I'm Ed Kohler, and I hope you found this helpful.